Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for some more Storycraft. I'd like to visit something that I haven't talked about since the end of 2017, which is the 4 phases of book creation, and I'd like to talk tonight about the revision phase. Revising your book can be either the most annoying part of the process, the most difficult part of the process, or it can be pretty straightforward and easy and sometimes even fun, but that really depends on how well you've executed those first 2 phases, the planning and the drafting phase. Indeed, the more you practice, and the more books that I've practiced certainly, the better I get at planning a good story and executing that initial draft so that there's less to fix in the revision phase, but also it's easier to fix the things that are actually wrong. You compare that with my first 2 books, which I still haven't ever put out. I didn't do a good job planning, and I didn't do a very good job executing either. So there's a huge amount that has to be fixed. Basically, you're looking at like a page 1 rewrite of the story to fix what was wrong. And that tends to make it difficult and annoying. But if you do a good job planning and executing, then that 3rd phase is pretty easy, and depending on your personality, can even be pretty fun. What I've gone ahead and done, and I've explained how I do things, and I tend to work from the big down to the small, and that's sort of how I recommend doing it, because if you start off by proofreading grammar and then you delete that scene, you've essentially wasted your time. So you want to start with the big stuff and then work your way down. 3 big areas. First big area is story revision. The next one's copy editing, and then the final one is proofreading. And in fact, proofreading, some people even put that in the publication phase. That's part of getting the manuscript ready to be like pressed into a book, you know. So what is story revision? Story revision is where you're going to fix all the big parts that matter about your story and making them work for the reader. So the first and most important one is revising the structure. So structural edits, these are the big things where you decide, you know, am I going to change something about a plot point? Does each section of the book wrap up with a correct plot point that propels it in the correct direction? Are the characters saying and doing the right things throughout the book, or do I need to alter them and then alter many other things that happen in the book to make it work? So your structure part is your biggest revision and usually your most difficult. But if you've planned really well, there's sometimes very little to be done in the structure phase except fine-tuning some things. Maybe adding a character into this scene because he needs to be there to say something important that sets up something else. So you're trying to make sure that everything flows together, everything works, and that your major plot points are all there and functioning. That's the point of structure. The next one is you should revise for the consistency of your story elements. Your story elements are going to be your character, setting, and plot. So consistency of setting would be, you know, if the story takes place in a forest, does it suddenly switch to a different environment at the end? You need to fix that. Or maybe there's a different name for the money at the beginning and at the end if you're writing fantasy. Or maybe, you know, the story starts off and it has a certain kind of focus on one area of a city, and before you know it, you're really just kind of focusing on a different area. Like maybe it starts off in South LA, and before you know it, like you're just spinning the entire story in Compton. That means you may want to just set everything in Compton if you were going to write it, you know, like a crime story in LA. The characters part, you want to make sure the characters are acting themselves all the way through it. And usually in the drafting phase, the characters get changed a little bit as you go. So you have one idea of how a character is, and by the time you finish writing the story, they've changed a little bit who they are, not in terms of growth, but you've kind of honed in on what that character is really all about. So you need to go back to the beginning of the story and fine-tune that character and make sure that you're describing him properly. Maybe when you first described him, you left out the fact that he was tall and muscular, and that's important later in the story. That's editing for consistency. And finally, plot. You want to make sure your big conflict is established, that all of your subplots are well established, what I call the plot goal is. And I haven't talked about Storycraft just plot. I will do that in a separate video. But you want to make sure all of your plot goals are clear and that you're setting up the events properly before they happen, that nothing's sort of coming out of thin air, that the reader, when something happens, they could see, oh, I see how that happened. So that's kind of sort of editing for consistency, and that characters are acting as if a past event actually happened. So if you add in an event that's important, in terms of plot in your structure phase, you now need to edit for consistency so that everybody's acting appropriately as if that event happened. Or you change the way an event happens, you then need to edit for consistency before and after so that it all works together, and that you're not repeating yourself and you're not contradicting yourself. You don't want to have a thing where like a character walks out of the room and then is talking later in a scene. That's a bit of consistency, and that actually gets down to the next little part of the story editing, or the story revision phase, which is editing for pacing and efficiency. This is where you're going to do your cuts. This is where I would read through my book and I would look at any scene, and if it didn't have some amount of characterization, some progress towards the plot, or something important towards the plot, some event happening, and wasn't exposing the setting, then I would look at rewriting it, combining it with another scene, or deleting it. And of course, if you rewrite it and combine it with another scene, then you got to look at that consistency part again. And those two things really can go quite well together. Pacing, this varies a lot, but a good rule of thumb is you kind of want something to happen every other page. Something important is said, some event happens, something's revealed on every other page in your manuscript, or quicker. If you're waiting too long for that, if you're going 4 or 5 pages without a big reveal, the reader might get bored. And if you're doing it too quickly, they might feel like they're rushed and they're not getting the whole story that's there, or they're not spending enough time with the characters. So I want every scene to have some amount of characterization and some plot thing that's happening. That's really important. If it's just characterization, you can have some scenes of just characters interacting. If it's revealing something important about their personalities, or if it's funny, there's some value to it that a reader's going to get out of it, other than just, I like my characters and I want them to have a cool conversation. If they can have that cool conversation around a plot point, that's going to help a lot. And there's big plot points and little ones, right? Some people say only the big ones are plot points, but there's lots of little events that happen that are important towards all the different plot goals that you have. When I talk about plot, there's some people look at A, B, C, D stories, right? You have a main story and then you have subplots. You want to make sure each of those is working. And in some cases, you may cut a subplot because it's not contributing to the overall goals and maybe hampering the pacing of your story. So that's editing for pacing and efficiency. That's where you're doing all the deleting. The next big area is what I call copy editing. Copy editing is where you're going to be editing for stylistic consistency. If you are writing, for instance, in a third-person personal perspective, meaning it's in third person, but it's really only focusing on the perspective of one character, you don't want to leap around and reveal things from other characters. So if you're writing in a third-person personal perspective, you don't want to reveal that another character is thinking something, because the character you're focusing on wouldn't know that. Likewise, if you're writing in first person, you want that person always be using the same approach to language, whether it's a formal approach or an informal approach. And likewise, you also want to make sure your language is either formal or informal, to what degree it is, and that it's always consistent. You don't want to be writing to the queen at the beginning of the book and then talking to Joe at the bar at the end of the book with your prose. You want those to kind of line up. And I don't know, I'll make another video about what exactly that could mean, but if you're really, trying to write great prose, make sure you're trying to write great prose throughout the book and you're not just dropping that halfway through and kind of firing quick sentences towards the end. So that's editing for consistency. That's an important part of copy editing and one of the most important parts. And then after that, you want to edit for just the way the prose works and the quality of the dialogue. And that's a detail-oriented editing strategy. This is where you're going to read through the book. You're going to read each sentence. You can read this aloud and it kind of helps with the flow of things. If you read things aloud and can hear how they sound, you can hear what the dialogue sounds like. Then you can tweak the dialogue a little bit if you want. In some cases, you may have a character not use a contraction. I cannot go that way. And you realize that the character would probably say, I can't. And so you might fix that. Or it might be a character who doesn't use contractions. Or it might be you're using too much kind of vernacular kind of slang and it's distracting, or you're not using enough. So you're going to figure out the quality of the dialogue. You're going to make it snappy and efficient. And you're probably going to want to be focusing on consistency once again. You always want to be thinking about whether the dialogue is working in the appropriate way for you. And that each piece of dialogue is saying something important, and is not boring to the reader. So that's the copy editing phase to me. All those little pieces. Then the final phase, the final thing that you do is the proofreading phase, and that's where you're going to go through and you're going to check spelling errors, grammar errors, that kind of stuff. And reading it out loud again can usually catch it. A lot of stuff. Now for me, for this last one, especially Needle Ash, I kind of relied on like a lot of my readers to catch extra spelling and grammar. I really only, because I was sticking to this rapid release schedule. I was like, I wrote 3 books and released them in 2 months. So a lot more spelling and grammar errors got through, especially in those early release ones, than what ended up kind of in the current version of the book. So if you have a lot of readers access that can shoot that stuff over to you via email, it's helpful. But if not, read it through like out loud one more time. If you can hand it to a friend to do proofreading, that helps a lot too. I usually try to do both those things, and there's still stuff that gets through. So the more eyes that you can get on the page, the more you're going to catch grammar and spelling errors, and word substitution errors, and all those little things that get through the cracks of the copy editing phase. And once you've done with the proofreading phase, and some people, again, they put this in the publication phase, and in fact I have had it in the publication phase, where I've been like, guys, here's the book, here's your pre-release version, let me know if there's typos, while I'm editing it and trying to fix it to go for like final release. Or in some cases, I've done this before, you have a pre-order. You don't want to lose your ability to have pre-orders on Amazon, so you're editing it like right up to the gills. You're trying to do proofreading to get it out, and sometimes you don't get the final version out until after the pre-orders all go out. You get it out like the second day. That's happened to me before, so it depends on how you want to actually set that up. Nowadays, I probably wouldn't do the pre-order thing as much because it just doesn't seem to have as much impact, but that's neither here nor there. So there's all your big phases of your revision process, going from the big stuff, the story. That's the most important. If your story is not functioning, it doesn't matter how well your prose is written. Make your story function, make everything consistent with the story, make sure it's well paced, then make sure the prose and the dialogue sounds good and your style is working correctly, and then you can do your proofreading. And if you do your proofreading first and then you change those things, you just wasted your time on stuff you may have deleted or changed, or you may have introduced more errors, because each time you rewrite something, you may introduce new errors. So you want to try to get all the proofreading done at the end if you can. So that's it for that little bit. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see and what you want to see, what you want to hear, that is. And you can get my books on Amazon. They're usually linked down below, or you can find links on dvspress.com. This series is the newest one, the Needle Ash series. Quite a bit of fun here. And this is my fantasy book from last year, Water of Awakening, which I'll have a kind of a second edition coming out this year, as well as second edition of Muramasa, which ought to look like this right here. These are mostly going to be some fixes in consistency, and as well as not structure stuff, but little inconsistencies that I've noticed as I've reread books, and of course, like fixing the typos that get through and that kind of stuff. So the second editions will be coming out soon, and I appreciate all your support on that, and I will see you guys next time.